So Ian, thank you so much for your willingness to be with us today and to engage in the conversation that I think none of us feel like we're experts in, but we just want to do our best. And I think we'll talk a bit about your history and your credentials, so we'll just climb straight into the questions if we can, to say, we come to this as two people concerned to be able to say, let's talk about living and dying, and how can those two things be done well. In the discipline in which I work, I regularly witness the reality of some people who die well, and in truth, I also have seen some people who don't. I see some families well prepared for the eventuality of death, and I see others who are not. And so I wondered, as an opening question for us today, I wondered to what extent do you think that death and our mortality, this subject, are hard for us to face? And do you think that in this world of overexposure, where in fact, compared to my childhood, we talk about almost anything today, which we never used to speak about before, do you think that death remains a taboo topic? Or, so just, do you think we're afraid of talking about death?
Well, culturally, death has always been something that people have tended to deny. We actually move away from it. That's been something in our culture. And it discourages us from facing our own mortality. The pandemic, and just chatting to Andrew briefly, we met for the first time, and the pandemic seems to have freed people in a way that mortality is a very real issue. So that may have brought us to a point where we are prepared to and able to speak a little more on it. But it's an interesting psychological issue, because with studies they've done in what they call experimental existential psychology, if there's a subconscious reference to death, then they found in these studies that people will drive faster, they'll drink more, and they'll smoke more in their attempt to diminish the anxiety. It's an interesting topic, because when we speak about it with people who are aware, they want to speak more about it. Let's get to know, let's face it, let's face to face this issue. And I had one phone call with quite a well-known person, quite a mature person, and we were chatting about things, and I said, I'm doing this chat with Rowan, and you'd be surprised how quickly the conversation ended after that. That was it. The shutters came down. So in the previous generation, it seems, Rowan, that sex was taboo. Didn't talk about it much. But now we're looking at death, and there's a concept that I've spoken about in other settings, where the concept of amortality, where people live as if they're never going to die. And we've got examples. We've got people like Clint Eastwood. He's 91 and he's producing movies. So why not? We're going to live as if we're never going to die.
And children, apparently.
And children. That was Mick Jagger, actually. Okay. He had about his 7th or 8th when he was in his 70s. But if I may be bold enough to quote this Scottish psychiatrist, Dr. Lang, and he rather cynically said, and I quote, "Life is a sexually transmitted disease with 100% mortality." And I think these people who live as if they're never going to die, we've got to work on that, because this is what we do. We're trying to do today.
Yeah. So thank you. So I think we're acknowledging that this isn't the simplest subject to talk about, and so we're grateful for those who join us today.
Yeah.
I suppose, and I'm speaking, I think, here out of my own anticipation of it, but I suppose that in the event of death, and perhaps the better word might be in the event of grief, I imagine most of us will be left with some sense of unfinished business. Even if it is the simplicity of going, because I hear this quite a lot from people, I just wish I could say I love you one more time, or I wish I could hear their voice one more time. So I think part of the fabric of grief is the sense of unfinished business. And I suppose my question for you would be to say, in your mind, is there any key business that we shouldn't neglect? So stuff that we really, if we're going to live well and die well, are there essentials that we shouldn't leave unfinished?
Well, there will always be unfinished business, and sadly, some unfinished business relationally may stay unfinished, and I'm sensitive to that. So we're not pushing that one, but if it's possible, that unfinished business, let's resolve it, because it allows people to experience a sense of peace and quietness, which they wouldn't have been able to do before that. So yes, there's an issue here. How do you talk about it? You know, how do you raise the subject? And so you may say, well, you know, if I'm talking to Joyce or Joyce is talking to me and we have chatted, but for anybody, if time becomes short, what would be the important things in your life? What really counts? What's important? And you were saying unfinished business. So relationally, that's almost a separate issue where one would need to look at even counseling perhaps and getting people together. But there's also the practical side. I've been in touch with the head of a fiduciary unit at a very large insurance company, and he gave me one of his so-called war stories. This is the war stories. And he tells the story of second marriage. This fellow had his will, and he got married the second time, and he died, and he bequeathed this property to his son from the first marriage. He was married in community of property, and his second wife claimed 50%, you know, legally entitled to do that. So there was the son from the first marriage and the wife from the second marriage. They both co-owned the property, but they weren't talking to each other. And that's just a little example where if we don't look at the practical things, we could be looking at issues which could really scar and cause a lot of damage. And the other thing he was telling me, so he told me a number of things, but this one case where the will was lost and they couldn't find the will. So they're practical things, and we're not going into that just for the moment. But unfinished business, yes, I think each in our own way, we would need to look at what is it? How do we approach it? There's not a one size fits all here.
Yeah, so we're not going to try to solve that particularly, but perhaps today would be just one of the takeaways that we leave for this group of people, is to be able to say, to the extent that we can anticipate it, to the extent that we are able to address it, that unfinished business, if we talk about living well, dying well,
yes.
dealing with unfinished business is an important thing. Important. I think that's what you're saying.
I am saying that.
Yeah.
I've been looking, and perhaps you've read his book, Steve Jobs, and an amazing personality. He died at the age of 56, and you may remember his commencement address to Stanford University. It's been viewed something like 41 million times. And he said, and I quote if I may, "Facing the reality of death, as hard and as heartbreaking as that can be, can free us to truly live life. No one wants to die. Even people who want to go to heaven don't want to die." And I thought, coming from Steve Jobs, that was quite a powerful comment. But I think what happens is when we face, if we get rid of the unfinished business and living well, dying well, if we look death squarely in the face, what does that mean? But if if I acknowledge my mortality, and I've lived and worked in territory where health and wellness and death, I mean, with medicine, this is what we do in pharmacology, keeping people well. I mean, we're here to live. I mean, that's the underlying. So we need to get those clear values, and I think unfinished business would help us do that.
Yeah, so it's a big thing. And if I can say again, we recognise we can't deal with it, but it's just the prompt we leave for today. One of the leaves. Is there anything unfinished?
Yeah.
And then you mentioned your work as a, if I can use the phrase, as a teacher of pharmacology. I know you shy away from it, but you were a professor of pharmacology.
Long time ago.
Yeah. And therefore you have a well above average understanding of some of the medical issues around death and dying. And we recognise, without needing to be detailed about it, we recognise that death meets us all differently. Some death comes to our families through just terrible tragedy. Some comes to us suddenly, we don't expect it. Some comes slowly. Some death comes far too early. Some comes very late in life. And across the world, it's a huge issue. I mean, it's a whole other topic. But across the world, assisted dying is one of the great controversial ethical issues, both in the religious community and outside the religious community.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you had, with your work with drugs, do you have any comment on the role of the medical community, particularly in the instances? I think we've recognised all these different kinds, but particularly in terms of slow or terminal illness and death.
I've read into this, and so I share with what I've read. I spend time at the University of Arizona, and I was saying to Andrew, the sunbirds come down from Canada to Tucson, where the winters are wonderful, and the summers are very, very hot. But they come down there, and as a result, you've got a lot of retirement homes. So you have a lot of work being done there. So drug therapy in the elderly was something that I focused on there. And so reading into this, there's some really good work, and I mentioned a book, I know, Malcolm, you've got it, it's called Being Mortal, Medicine and What Matters in the End. Wonderful book, written by a top physician, and this is the issue that, and just to develop this, because I think it's important, when we arrive at the acceptance of our own mortality, and a clear understanding of the limits and the possibilities of medicine, it becomes a process. We think there's a silver bullet for everything. But I know at my age, there are certain things that they will sort out and we'll carry on living. But there isn't a silver bullet. There's not a complete answer for everything. And when we accept that, if we see this as a process, this realization, this awareness, then we begin to realize that if we look at medicine, we're looking at in terminal illness, in life-shortening illnesses, we're looking at what is important is comfort and care rather than survival. Now that's quite a controversial statement.
Yeah.
And perhaps I should pause there. But what we're saying is, if I'm at the last stage of life, I'm wanting comfort and care. I'm not wanting an extra survival 6 months if there's discomfort, I'm away from my family, etc. So that's a realization that many people fight against.
Yeah.
And this fellow, this Dr. Atul Gawande, he's brilliant, and I recommend him, and that would be something that you may want to take up later. But what we tend to do is perhaps delegate the management of emotional and spiritual tasks to our medical team as well. They're wonderful medical people out there, wonderful. But we should be actually through, and again, I think the church, what we're doing this morning is part of the role of the church. And we can't just delegate to the medical people, sort out the emotional and even spiritual issues.
So Ian, with some of that stuff, what we're really saying for us is we're saying, and please help me, because I'm just going, so what we're saying is one of the gifts we can give, because we're really talking about two things today. We're talking about, on the one hand, how can I personally be prepared for my own dying? But the other part of it is really, which is the pastoral thing I was talking about earlier, was how can we be a gift to our family and our loved ones and those we leave behind to be able to do that? And I think what I'm hearing you say with this one is to be able to say clarity on things like a living will would be very helpful for our families, so they know what to do, and clarity on that. And I have prepared some information to leave behind for those who need information on living will. But I think that's some of what you're saying, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I think when we have these discussions, you're far more likely, and I quote now from Gavande's work, but there's a much greater chance of dying at peace and sparing the family anguish. I can give you examples close to me. There have been 2 occasions where the person was advanced stage. I mean, there was no chance of this person ever recovering, and mentally there was no recognition at all. And the families had to make a decision on what they call a PEG. That's percutaneous. It's directly into the stomach, and the person is fed. So the person stays alive. Now, if I have said this, and in the living will it's implied, that if you're at that stage of life, don't feed me. Just keep me comfortable. In other words, We're looking at the care and the comfort of the patient. But in these two cases, the family said, but I can't let him starve to death. I must put that pig in. But that's not what was wanted at that stage. But you can't, for those two situations, very close to me, there was emotional, the decision was a pig. But I want to say that if those two gentlemen had been able to say in their living will, the family would have been relieved of that decision to say, yes, we'll do it. Because you can't let your loved one starve to death.
Yeah, it goes against everything we know.
That's right.
Yeah.
But keep me comfortable.
Yeah.
Be with me if you can.
And to say, you know, from a pastoral point of view, I have witnessed, and again, out of the same love, I've witnessed living wills being overridden by a family because they've been anxious about those kind of dynamics. And so it becomes, these are very difficult, and just as we say, we prepared for this conversation, but even now I feel the difficulty of being able to say,
to express it.
As hard as it is, please don't feed me. You know, I mean, that's, you know, exactly. Like, it's hard to do that.
It goes against.
Yeah.
When I was in Tucson, I remember being in this ward. The first time I saw separated Alzheimer units was in Tucson. This was in the 90s. And on their folder, there was a DNR. I was young. I was quite a lot younger then.
You can explain what a DNR is.
Yes, I do. Yeah. A DNR was do not resuscitate. And on these folders, if somebody in that particular unit, they'd given permission to say, do not resuscitate. Now, what happens? And you read stories, go back to this medicine, what medicine in the end, and where the family will rush out, they'll get the paramedics will do everything they can to the terminally ill patient who may have perhaps a month to go. So it's a natural thing to want to do. I must try and get the heart beating again. This is controversial for some, and it's sensitive for some, and I realize that. I'm not forcing views, I'm just expressing experiences. So there are other things. Do I want antibiotics in that terminal stage? You will remember, many of us, that pneumonia was known as the old person's friend. Is that a term that we've come across? The old person's friend, and that's how it was. So it's an emotional tussle, unless we say a living will, very easy to draw up. It frees the family from grief and turmoil.
And medical ethics, I think, are complicated. I mean, this is a bit of a tangent, but to say one of the things that I suppose it's the wrong word to say amuses me, but is at least curious, is to say that on death row in America, they're often not providing medical care until the very last moment, because it's kind of the medical commitment to sustain life.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Well, I think this is, and we haven't got time to go into it today, but you know, our wonderful medical people, and I have such admiration. We've got wonderful doctors and nurses and carers, but their instinct and their oath is to preserve life. And that I respect deeply, deeply, deeply. And so unless they get help from the patient.
And their family.
And their family.
Yeah. So that's our takeaway for this part of the conversation.
It is. Yeah. Can I just say a quick word about the care? You know, it was in 1680, and this gentleman, Sir Thomas Sydenham, and this is what he said: among the remedies which it has pleased Almighty God to give man to relieve his sufferings, none is so universal and so efficacious as opium. And then in 1806, morphine was separated from the opium poppy. And now we've got variations on opium. But that is a gift which you've been given, and there are many, many, many drugs which can make, for people like me, if I get to that stage, when I get to that stage, care and comfort, rather than keeping me alive for another 3 weeks or whatever. Yeah.
Sure, I'm just wondering whether I should get into it, but maybe I should say, because none of us actually knows, I don't think, but I think you were saying to me in one of our conversations that I'm not sure what the word is, I want to use the word consequence, I'm not sure it's correct, but the consequence of some of these drugs means that in our last hours or days, where we might look like we're struggling or suffering, that in fact the drug is keeping us quite peaceful, and to our family it might not look so, but to a relative degree you are able to offer a measure of assurance to say, maybe.
I think it's difficult because each case would vary.
Yeah.
I think the patient could look distressed and wasn't feeling distressed, and there would be obviously shortness of breath and so on, and so very discomforting viewing. But with the right people medicating, they would be able to ensure that patient was comfortable. Yes, and there are wonderful drugs out there. I mean, your benzodiazepines, your sublingual Ativans, and the living will. Just a last comment, if I may, because it's a narrative. It personalizes it, and we remember it. But my late sister died of motor neuron disease, and one evening we were called out late, and she was not in a good place. She was in a care facility. She needed to get to the emergency center, and we took her across. But before we took her across, she couldn't communicate. And we had this chart, and with her eyes, she could look at the various corners for the colors, for the letters, and eventually we got to the point where she was saying, "Don't forget the living will."
Wow.
When we got to the emergency center, this was a very important component. So that's just to earth it. I mean, that's a vivid memory in my mind.
Yeah.
And that was what she wanted. So it's a difficult subject to talk about, but I think, and for me, and I'm just thankful to you for inviting me to do this, because it's opened up aspects which I find very helpful.
I'm being silly when I say this, but I feel like I hear us saying living wills might be important.
That's correct. That's right.
Can we begin to land the plane a little and say, because we've got other conversations we want to have today, and Ian, it's a well-established common wisdom that we should begin any meaningful endeavor, whether it's in business or even theology, we're going to begin any meaningful endeavor with the end in mind. And that having the end in mind mostly helps us to focus on the present, to live the present well. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on how that idea, that common, well-established idea, could help us in our thinking about our dying. Our living and our dying.
Our living and our dying, living well, dying well. Well, there's a well-known, excuse me, Tim Keller, and I think you even have Twitter link. But Tim Keller's not well at all. He's been treated for lung cancer. But this is what he said, and I'll read it. Rather than living in fear of death, we should see death as spiritual smelling salts. We remember smelling salts. Remember sulfur-lately. It's spirit of ammonia. And what happens when we have the smelling salts under our nose? It causes a inhalation reflex. We just breathe more deeply. The heart beats faster. Our oxygen levels go up. And that's what he's saying. He says that if we see death as spiritual smelling salts, what it will do, it can wake us up to live a life that's rich and full and meaningful. And I like that. I really did. And when we deny death, we live less wholeheartedly. We live less completely. And I think, look, I've had to process some of these thoughts. And some of these ideas, you'll say, well, I'll think more about that, or no, that doesn't fit for me. But some may think about them, just to process them. They're just one or two other things. And
so can I just interrupt and say, I found, like the biblical notion, clearly for the Apostle Paul, for example,
yes,
he had a very long view in mind, the famous Romans 8 passage. But he also spoke in the language which we spoke about in church on Sunday. But he also spoke the language of kind of running the race and finishing the race, and kind of attaining something. Kind of saying, so as much as we see eternity as eternity, there is this sense of going, there comes a moment where for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. But there is, we in our theological thinking, we don't think of one uniform journey entirely. There is this moment of ending, and that ending, it can be our smelling salts, can be our awakening.
It can be our awakening, and I think it can lead us then to ask important questions. What is really important? Am I more conscious of what is really important now in my life? because I've actually faced my mortality. And I think the two questions, I'm just trying to think who said them, somebody profound, not me. Am I loved? Did I love well? Those are the two very, very...
Should we say it again?
Am I loved?
Am I loved?
Did I love well?
Did I love well?
Yeah. And I think they just help us discover where our values and where our meaning, where they are. And can I just share with you, I found this so interesting, going back to Charles Wesley. And
to say, for those who don't know, who aren't Methodists, Charles Wesley.
didn't he write a hymn or two?
He wrote a hymn or two.
Well, this is what a physician said to Charles Wesley, and I'll quote. In those days, the Methodists were known for their good deaths. And a physician who treated several Methodists made the claim to Charles Wesley, most people have a fear of dying, but I never met with such people as yours. None of them are afraid of death, but are calm and patient and resigned to the last. Now,
fantastic, eh?
Yeah.
Won't you read it again? I do, just because I think this is where we're going.
Yeah.
This is our point. Eh?
Yeah.
So we hear it.
Well, this is what the physician said to Charles. Most people have a fear of dying. True. But I never met with such people as yours. None of them are afraid of death, but are calm and patient and resigned to the last. Yeah. But we can't leave it there.
We can't leave it there.
Can I go to Charlie Brown and Snoopy?
You may. No, not quite Charles Wesley, but we'll take it.
But there we've got Charlie Brown and Snoopy. They're sitting on the edge of a pier looking out over the river. And Charlie Brown says, "We only live once, Snoopy." And Snoopy says, "Wrong. We only die once. We live every day." I think that's true. And I gather we're getting close to coffee.
We are. But I have a little rebuttal because I know what you're about to tell us. So you say your comment and I'll give you a rebuttal.
Okay. Can I say my comment?
Yeah, say your thing.
Well, in our discussions earlier in the week, Rowan advertised our meeting this morning saying that what would be guaranteed would be the best coffee when we finish this talk. And I'm sure that's the reason why. Could be that one or two people may be here. But having said that, then I came across a study recently, and it was something like 170,000 coffee drinkers, and they found that if you have 1.5 to 3.5 cups of coffee a day, the risk of dying in the next few years is reduced by 30%.
How's that, eh? And then you will not believe it. I mean, I don't really think it is like a divine thing, but you won't believe it. On Twitter, this morning, a Sky News report says that tea drinkers are given a chance of living longer if you drink 2 cups of tea a day or something. So I feel like it might be the hot drink industry are trying to do something.
And you think we've helped a little bit?
We must have helped.